How's everybody doing? Happy almost leap year.
Nick's starting out with a little bit of frivolity, which is something that we didn't get a whole lot of the first couple years he was here. I think he's feeling comfortable. I'm feeling comfortable with Nick Caserio. He gives some long answers, but he gives some really good and choice little nuggets within some of those long answers that sometimes it's easy to miss out on. So I cut out the little nuggets. I've got nothing but nuggets for you people today. The first one is one in which he brought up Nico Collins unprompted. This was in response to a question about the use of the franchise tag. The Nico Collins part came up midway through the answer, just out of nowhere, out of the blue.
You don't necessarily have to use all your money up in 1 year. So we've tried to, and I've talked about this previously, really look at your team in sort of 2-year increments. So whatever you don't do this year, that money's going to be used in future years. I'm sure I'll get a question here very soon about Nico Collins. That's coming.
Yeah, the question never came. Nobody asked a question about Nico Collins after that. I can't fault them. A lot of times people just have their questions in mind and they're not necessarily listening. They're thinking about how am I going to phrase this next question, not look like an idiot on the NFL Network. But I do think the fact that Nick mentioned Nico Collins, who really blossomed this year, obviously, and in addressing somebody today who's skeptical of Nico Collins, I think the thing you really got to remember is that, like last year, his catch rate was down in the 50s. And yet he wasn't dropping a whole lot of footballs, or he wasn't being charged with drops because the balls that were being thrown to him when he was targeted were so errant. This year, you get a ball placement specialist in CJ Stroud throwing it to him, and he looked like a different guy. The other part is, if you start talking about maybe extending Nico Collins this year before he hits free agency at the end of this season, wide receivers are just going to keep getting pricier and pricier. Teams realize, man, we draft these quarterbacks in the first round, and like 1 in 15 is a CJ Stroud. If that, we'll see where CJ goes. Where if you give a mediocre quarterback or a mediocre plus quarterback a Tyreek Hill and a bunch of weaponry like that, then man, these wide receivers are very valuable. The second is that, look, the cap expanded this year. There's more revenue from gambling. There's more revenue from various media outlets. That's probably going to keep going on. But the salaries are going to get bigger and bigger. So I think they got to think right now about locking Nico Collins down. So I wanted to get that Nico Collins comment in first. I'm going to jump back to the beginning of the press conference where his opening comments were a little bit about what they're looking for at the Combine and what you can expect.
The Combine is interesting because it gives us an opportunity to really learn the players' stories. I'd say that's really the big thing. The on-field workouts, I think that's more for you all to watch and figure out who runs fast and who doesn't. But the next time we use how fast an offensive lineman ran a 40 in our evaluation will be the first.
I think that's flack. I think all of a sudden they've figured out some special sauce to where the 40 correlates to offensive line productivity. I don't know. The three-cone drill, though. The three-cone drill, the guys that have really, really good three cones amongst the offensive line, there's starting to be some data with that. Who knows? That might evaporate after this. But watch the three-cone drills this weekend, everybody. The next question, and this is an answer that ends up leading to me believing that they're really thinking about Nico Collins long-term. The question was about prioritizing the needs of the team headed into the draft and the free agency process.
The big thing D'Amico and I have talked about on a consistent basis is just trying to build as deep and consistent a roster, top to bottom. Say we've had constructive conversations with a number of agents. Start with our players. We'll have an opportunity to visit with some of the agents of other players that may want to be Houston Texans. Whether or not there's a mutual interest or not, we'll find that out here as we go.
I think as far as building a complete team, I don't read too much into those specific comments. But if you look across the board, the number of Texans free agents that there are, guys who are on the team last year, there are currently 10 starting positions where the guy who was there, the incumbent, is a free agent and either leaving the team or needs to be re-signed. So that's a whole lot of, 2 starting linebackers, a starting defensive tackle, your starting defensive end and Jonathan Grenard, plus your 2 main backups are both free agents. You've got a starting cornerback. You've got the place kicker and the punter. The kicker can't be franchise tagged. There's needs out there. And yes, you can always do with more and better wide receivers, but I think there are just more pressing needs in free agency. So that's where I am, and I think that's why spending exorbitantly on a wide receiver right now, despite no matter how much cap space you have, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm going to be surprised if they go after Mike Evans, for instance. Although I love Mike Evans, don't get me wrong, just because I'm saying they shouldn't go after Mike Evans doesn't mean I don't love Mike Evans. I just love other guys in positions where there are no current starters right now. Next question. This caught Nick by surprise a little bit, but it was about whether the success they had this season made it easier for them to decide on how they wanted to pursue free agency in the draft.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what that means. I think our focus is just trying to put the best team together possible. And sure.
Okay, so here the question was clarified for Nick, and he answered.
I've expressed this countless times. It's not about one person. It's not about one player. Every year is different. We're not really believers in windows, not really sure what that means. So it's about the 2024 season, trying to put the best team together. What are our options? We'll explore our options, and we'll try to make good decisions, good sound decisions that make sense for our team.
That was about as impatient as you see Nick get. This is either the strength or the weakness in having a GM who spent 2 decades in New England. Because I think if you talk to somebody that was up with the Patriots for that long, and you ask them like, "Hey, what's your championship window?" Like 2 decades, and I don't know, like win 6 Super Bowls. I don't know, 2 decades. There's your window. As long as you have a quarterback and you can figure out ways to build a team around them. I don't like the Chiefs. Was their championship window only when Pat Mahomes was on his rookie contract? Because they seem to have done pretty well since then. Next question is about what he thinks is going to happen with the running back market this season. He ends up giving 2 answers here. The second one's about Devin Singletary. The first one is this.
Free agency is just, it's what does the market tell you? So, and then any player, what are you willing to pay that player commensurate with their role? So every year markets change, and I think sometimes what happens is, I'd say with some of the tender numbers, you sort of get pigeonholed or benchmarked, because once you establish a certain financial commitment level, that's almost used as a starting point. So you're either comfortable paying that level or you're not, and it's all about resource allocation.
So 2 things about that was interesting to me. One was that, look, you can't predict what the market's going to be. So I think the Texans might have a shopping list of things that they would like, but then they get to the grocery store and they realize that, like eggs are like, I don't know how much eggs cost, $10 a dozen or something. That's too expensive. And you realize, okay, we can't get eggs, which this year for us is a defensive tackle, whatever it might be. So you got to be very fluid. And I think Nick's very comfortable being very fluid in a lot of these situations, just understanding you're going to have to stick and move along the way. The second part was about the franchise tag. And he brought this up a few times, or at least a couple times yesterday, that when you use the franchise tag, say on a running back, which I'd be very surprised if they used it on Devin Singletary, or Dalton Schultz, if you used it on him, I would be less surprised if they used it on Dalton Schultz. But that when you use that franchise tag, and let's say with a tight end, I think it's $12 million for a 1-year deal. Usually what that does is, it with the agent and the player, it almost like sets that as the baseline. So like, okay, I'm going to get a 4-year. If we get a long-term deal, then it's going to be 4 years at $12 million per year. And the team might not feel that way and might not feel that player is worth that much. So they have to be careful in doling that out and thinking that they're going to be able to come to terms with a long-term contract right now. The second part of this answer is about Devin Singletary himself.
Motor had a great year, did a lot of good things for us. Motor's a free agent, so we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So there's a lot of good players that are out there. There's a lot of good players that are out there at a number of different positions, and our job is to evaluate and try to make good decisions.
It was pretty consistent between both Nick and D'Amico that they spoke with almost affection about Devin Singletary, D'Amico especially. And I think that they didn't seem as guarded perhaps as when they were talking about John Grenard. D'Amico talked about John Grenard after his podium session 2 days ago. And, I think when D'Amico talked about Dalton Schultz also, he seemed a little bit more guarded. I think both of those are going to be much more competitive situations where with running backs, we know what the deal is with the market on running backs. And perhaps they don't feel like it's going to be as hard to re-sign Devin Singletary. And I don't think Devin Singletary probably feels like he needs to be a bell cow running back somewhere. If Devin Singletary comes back in, I'm guessing he's expecting that the Texans are still going to sign somebody else, Derrick Henry or a Saquon Barkley or somebody like that. I don't know. But they just want to keep the door open for Devin Singletary because the price probably isn't going to expand too much because running backs. The next question Let's see if Nick takes the bait. It's about Bryce Young and how what happened to Young on the field, whether it has impacted Nick's evaluation process.
Yeah, I would just caution people this time of year to pay too much attention to narratives that are out there about players or what teams are doing. So I would just say, going back to last year, there was quite a bit of misinformation out there about what happened or what the Texans were going to do. So really, the only people that knew what the Texans were going to do were Coach Ryans and myself. So I'm saying is we made the decisions that we feel are best for the Texans, and I'd say I'd be careful just to read into too many narratives about what a team is or is not going to do.
Yeah, look, I would go back to the 49ers in the year that they drafted Trey Lance as well, because remember, it had become like all but a guarantee, and it was public knowledge that the 49ers were totally going to draft Mac Jones, and you're an idiot if you don't think otherwise. Like, obviously that wasn't the case. And it started to get that way last year where people just became convinced that the Texans weren't going to take a quarterback. And it was just another example of, oh, the Texans are so stupid. And then the same people who had said the Texans weren't going to take a quarterback, then after the draft, just stated like it was a matter of fact that the Texans would have liked Bryce Young more than CJ Stroud. So, like, nah, your credibility is shot with me on what the Texans did and did not like. If you're one of those people that was wringing your hands or forecasting that the Texans weren't going to take a quarterback, like, nobody knew a damn thing. Damn it. Not a thing. Another thing that not a lot of people knew was that the cap was going to expand by $10 million more than people expected. It was the fourth largest expansion of the cap by dollar amount in CBA history. So there was a question about whether that increase was going to impact his process of evaluating the budget.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it doesn't necessarily change how we're going to approach this offseason. We were already in a decent position. And I would just say it's probably potentially could be more of a one-time thing. So depending on what the number is, maybe gives you a little flexibility. Could be add a singular player, could be add multiple players at a certain tier or level. Whether or not you use the money this year and push it to next year and roll it to next year. So I would say the result of what happened the other day doesn't necessarily change our thought process about how we were going to approach free agency.
My gut would tell me that the Texans might be a little bit more tempted to use the franchise tag on Dalton Schultz with this extra room that they have under the cap now. And I think a lot of teams might be thinking like that, like, okay, well, hey, this is kind of a 1-year bonus. Let's just sneak this guy in for 1 year. But like you talked about earlier, sometimes in doing that, you might be signing on for more than you're comfortable spending over the next 3 or 4 years if you extend that guy to a contract. If they were to use the franchise tag, I think it would be on Dalton Schultz. I think for John Grenard, it's just going to be too pricey. That's upwards of $21 million or so. And I'm not sure the Texans are willing to spend that much money on a 1-year deal or a multi-year deal for Jonathan Grenard. I think for Dalton Schultz, it makes a little bit more sense. Now, they did get him for just $6 million last year. So they might think, hey, we can go out and find another Dalton Schultz type guy. I'm not so sure about that, just because, for one, Dalton Schultz has formed a really good relationship with CJ Stroud. They're getting more and more on the same page. Sure, you'd love to have a tight end who's a better run blocker, and those guys come along in the draft. They come along in free agency next year, whatever it might be. But even though CJ could form that relationship again with a new tight end next year, what you have now is an ability to build on the relationship that he has right now. So whatever they were able to develop this year, you get that much further along next year. You know, Tom Brady with Julian Edelman. It's not like the first year they had some success together that was it and they stopped working on things. Last one we'll listen to here. This is one that brought back traumatic memories for me. He was asked about on how he evaluates potential prospects, and I jumped into the middle of the answer here, just talking about guys' personal stories.
I mean, without getting into any players in particular, but we had a player the other night that was talking about, his house was shot. He was in the house while there were shots fired on his home. Another player had a commute on a daily basis from one city to the next to go to a certain high school.
When I was at the Combine, coming out of Cornell, I'm interviewing with Green Bay, and one of their scouts asks me to describe a time that I'd faced some hardship. And for God knows what reason, I I didn't want him to think that I was a whiner. So I just said, I haven't really faced any hardship. Like, I don't know. It was the dumbest thing this haunts me to this day. To the point that one of my greatest hardships in life has been dealing with the mental fallout of answering the question that way. Like, I still feel like there's a folder up in Green Bay somewhere that says this Payne kid is like must have grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth and never had any hardship. I had a boatload of hardship. I never got my house shot up, but I totally riding your bike to school. My God, that was I spent summers riding my bike to the farm to work, and then riding from the farm to football practice in August, and then from football practice home. Stupid. Skeptical of Nico Collins. I think the thing you really got to remember is down in the 50s. The ball placement specialist and CJ Stroud throwing it to him. This year, you get a ball placement specialist and CJ Stroud throwing it to him, and he looked like a different guy. The other part is, if you start talking about maybe extending Nico Collins this year before he hits free agency at the end of this season,